I'm here with John M. Owen. Been on the podcast before. I don't know, was that like a year ago? It was quite a while ago now, where we talked about your book, The Ecology of Nations, in which you sort of broke down the way in which you look at geopolitics and how different nations and states interact with each other. It's very interesting. Geopolitics is very interesting. And it's sort of, obviously, now we're going to be talking about geopolitics and what's happened over the past month, which has been like crazy with Iran and Israel and all of the conflicts in the Middle East. And maybe even we'll talk about Russia and Ukraine. But I thought there's been an interesting rise on the political right in this like hyper isolationist position and just don't get involved in anything. America, sort of America first is what they call it, though I don't actually think it's America first. But this isolationist ideology. And so I thought, let's have a conversation about isolationism, what's happening in the Middle East, and see where this goes. That said, to begin, maybe you could just give people a brief overview as to what your book, The Ecology of Nations, was about, and sort of what your philosophy is surrounding geopolitics.
Yeah, good. Thanks. Well, Andy, it's really good to be back with you. I do think it was about a year ago, and I was then is now in Vancouver. I'm actually in the 51st state to be, or they don't like that very much. In fact, I'll say this is Canada Day, the national day, and I've been coming. My wife's from here, and so we live in Virginia, but we come up here every summer, and so I've done it for 30 some years. I've never seen as many maple leaf flags around as I'm seeing now. So patriotism has been stirred up here by all the 51st state jokes. So maybe that's the point.
Maybe
that is very interesting.
Well, it lost. I heard that it affected the election. A lot.
A 24-point swing. Yeah.
Wow,
so
that's crazy.
Huge.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my book, let me start by talking about the national interests. Is I think everybody in these debates tends to say, well, that's what we're trying to safeguard, the national interest. Mm-hmm. And, it's good to find common ground, at least common language.
Sure.
And so I think that the national interest of any country is not just partly its physical safety, safety from foreign attack, maybe first and foremost, and from foreign intimidation. So you don't want to be for another country to, make you do something you don't want to do because you're afraid of them. All right. Just kind of simple, abstract terms. That involves being wealthy, having a capable military, right? All that sort of thing. I completely accept it. That is paramount. Mm-hmm. National sovereignty is another way, or independence. Like you are not a colony, you're an independent sovereign state. But national interest also entails, at least for Americans, but I think for other countries, having a certain regime type, a certain form of internal organization, which we can call constitutional democracy in our case, or constitutional republic, or liberal democracy. There are different terms for it. We have majority rule. We have the rule of law. We have individual rights. All this kind of this kind of hybrid regime we have that we've had all along. It's evolved some. It's we've made some changes. I think for the most part for the better. But that's not just kind of a nice extra. Like it's great. The main thing is to be secure from foreign attack, but it's great to be a democracy too. That's cool. We're good with that, but it's not. I think it's more than that. I think these things are really joined at the hip, and to the point where we Americans, most of us believe that to be a secure country, we need to be a constitutional democracy. If we were to become a dictatorship or communist, it would also weaken the country. It would make us weaker as a nation. It would divide us even more, blah, blah, blah. So now I think this is not just about the United States. I think the Chinese government and at least a lot of the Chinese people believe something similar, that the Chinese national interest entails not just physical security from attack and being rich and powerful, but having, in their case, the Communist Party monopolize power.
Sure.
And for them, again, these things go together. If you want a secure, powerful China, you got to have the Communist Party in charge. You and I can say, well, that doesn't sound right. Mm-hmm. But the Chinese Communist Party certainly believes it's the case. You can believe they do. And a majority, polling shows a majority, if insofar as you can trust polling of people in an authoritarian country, most Chinese people will say, yeah, for now, at least, it's good to have a single party in charge. We look at the Americans in their country as multi-party democracy, but it seems kind of in turmoil, and we don't want that here. We've had that in the past. It doesn't work for us. Okay, so why am I belaboring this point? Because I think it's a good starting place to understand why people like me say the United States really can't live in isolation from other countries and can't be indifferent, much less hostile toward other democracies out there in the world. And it's because, the old poem, "No man is an island." No country's an island. I mean, some countries like Great Britain is an island, sure, but it's not in that social and political sense. It's not an island. It interacts all the time, and the United States interacts all the time economically, socially, legally, politically, militarily, diplomatically with other countries and with international institutions and rules, many of which we made and shaped, and we made them to our benefit for the most part, or tried to. And why do we do that? Why are we so concerned with what I call the international environment? Because our leaders over the decades have, and this goes back at least to the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, our leaders have sensed, if not known explicitly, that the fate of our own democracy, of our constitutional democracy, is not just up to us. We dwell in this environment, international environment, that can affect how easy it is for us to be democratic or how hard it is. So some features of the international environment can actually favor autocracy, certain types of rules and practices, certain information. And so I'll go back to something, a lot of your listeners will know, others maybe a little less familiar with. I mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. So in 1823, 202 years ago, President James Monroe, who comes from near where I live, Charlottesville, Virginia.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, his house, I recommend Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe all have old houses outside of Charlottesville. So.
Oh, wow.
And
you've been, I assume, right?
What's that?
Have you been to their house?
Yeah. It's well worth. All these are well worth to put in a plug for my part of Virginia. Please come on down.
Sweet.
But it was not what they called back then the State of the Union address. It was just the president's address to Congress. And back then he didn't even read it. A clerk from the Senate read it. But it covered most of the waterfront. In 1823, there was a lot of issues we wouldn't be as familiar with. But one was on foreign policy. And he said, we note with concern that over in Europe, the monarchies are looking very threatening to young republics. And they had in mind Spain. And I won't go into the history there, but Spain had a revolution, and France had sent an invasion army of 100,000 troops into Spain to restore the old monarchy.
Wow.
And so what does it have to do with the United States? Well, in the decade previous to 1823, there was a series of revolutions in Latin America to our south and in the Caribbean. And Spain and Portugal had lost almost all of their empires in the New World. And in their place, there are all these republics. And we Americans were thrilled at this. Yay, sister republics to our south, all the way down to the tip of South America. To the north was still Canada, which was a British colony at that point. But to the south, sister republics, wonderful. And so Monroe said, here's a warning. And this part of the speech was actually written by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And but anyway, the message said, a warning to you European monarchs, don't try what you just done in Spain, restoring the monarchy. Don't try it here. We don't want your system. He called it, you have this political system of monarchy over there. We don't want it here. So we're never going to tell you how to govern your affairs. We're never going to try to spread our Republican, small r Republican, anti-monarchical system to you, but you better not try to spread your system back over here, right?
Right.
And it was a bluff because the U.S. had hardly any Navy at that point. But, excuse me, the British Navy, ironically, for its own reasons, enforced the Monroe Doctrine for many decades.
Wow.
Anyway, so why were Monroe and John Quincy Adams so concerned about republics in Latin America? Why not just let the Latin American, let the chips fall, and as long as we're up here, we're fine? No, they recognized that the future of U.S. republicanism was tied up in some way to having more and more Republican neighbors. If before Spain and Portugal lost their empires, the United States was almost by itself in the Western Hemisphere as a republic. It was very uncomfortable. They were always concerned about monarchies invading, not just the British, but maybe the Spanish.
Yeah.
And that worry was alleviated in the 1810s, and James Monroe didn't want it to come back. All right. So what's the broader point here? The United States, back then, leaders knew we couldn't live in isolation. We were in a world of other countries whose regime types affect ours, whose practices, whose norms, whose diplomatic practices. Trading with them affects us, what kind of country we are going to be. They just knew this. So fast forward to the 20th century, the 1930s, all right, a little less than a century ago. Fascism and communism are making gains all over Europe and Latin America, particularly fascism. There's even, there are communists in the United States, and some of the labor unions. They're fascists, pro-Nazis, not many, but enough to be a little bit worrisome.
Yeah.
And it's becoming harder and harder to be a democracy for various reasons. And the Franklin Roosevelt's administration recognizes something's gone wrong. The Great Depression is a big part of the story. Depression through, we had a 25% unemployment rate in the early 1930s. And it looked like the democracies in Europe and even ours and in Canada were having trouble solving the problem. The fascist states actually were putting men back to work in the military in large part. And so a lot of folks said, look, we've had a good run with this democracy thing, but it's done. In the modern, what counted as modern in the 1930s, modern world fascism looks like the better, or maybe communism, but not liberal democracy.
Right.
And so then you had even worse event, World War II, which Nazi Germany nearly won. And so at the end of that war, the British, the Americans, other democracies got together and said, we need to take some steps to make sure, in my language, the international environment is friendlier to democracy than it had, because the 30s were a really close run thing.
Yeah.
And so they set up a number of rules and institutions that made it easier for democracies to trade with each other. The United States and the Europeans set up NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, under which the U.S. would protect its European democratic allies. Separate treaty the U.S. signed with Japan, which was also a young democracy. The Marshall Plan, the United States gave a ton of money to these European democracies to help them get their economies back on their feet so that they would be stable democracies. This is all out of self-interest, right? Again, it comes back to what I was saying about the national interest. It's not just the case that we want to be a secure, powerful country, though we certainly do. We also want to remain a liberal democracy, and those things go together. So we need to think about not just having a capable military and enough nuclear warheads and aircraft carriers. All that is vitally important. Right. But we also have to think about how many democracies are out there, how healthy are there, is a number of autocracies growing, how powerful are the autocracies, and that's what Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, these guys back then thought very, very hard about. And that's a system we've inherited. And I think it hasn't been perfect. It's had a lot of problems. It needs reform now, I would say. But what you call isolationists, I think, don't recognize this entire system we set up that includes friendly, long-term friendly relations with democracies where we argue about things, we disagree. We're not on the same page all the time, but fundamentally we're committed to their defense and they're committed to us. That's been in the American national interest, not just something we do because we're nice or because we're suckers. It's because it's in our interest, understood in the fullest sense.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things as you're talking that I'm thinking about, because I think one of the fundamental problems with the isolationist perspective is that they don't understand the cancerous nature of certain ideologies. Authoritarianism it doesn't just stop. No authoritarian is like, okay, we're just going to stop here. We're not going to attack anybody else or try to take more land or try to invade another country. There's these ideologies, at least I think, have particular tendencies toward expansion, and that not holding these authoritarian countries back or pushing them back or having systems set up to kind of keep them contained will down the road, I think, mean that they're going to, like Nazi Germany is a prime example. But even if you look at, China's been eyeing up particular areas and Russia invaded Ukraine. There's all these questions as to what's people in the West, people in the United States, especially because we're just over here on the side of the world without any problems. We have oceans around us. We like to think of everybody else in the East as sort of, we all just sort of think the same way, and everybody is sort of just like, Putin doesn't want to just continue to expand. He just wants to stay. He just wants his land back that he thinks is his, that's in Ukraine. And I don't even know if that's true or not. All I'm saying is that there seems to be a disconnect with the isolationists, that certain ideologies, certain political philosophies are inherently authoritarian and expansionist. And if we don't do things to mitigate that now, later on, we're going to get into a situation like World War II. Or at least that's what it feels like to me. Is that an accurate assessment of that?
Yeah. Look, so I'll qualify it in the following way. I would say not all authoritarians are that expansionist. So you had some, I mentioned Latin America a minute ago. So, in the 30s and 40s, Brazil was governed by this guy, Getulio Vargas. He's definitely authoritarian, kind of admired Mussolini, the fascist.
Yeah.
But there's no evidence he really wanted to spread that system. Brazil's a big country. It just needs the system for itself.
Right.
And so as long as its neighbors allow it to do it, it seemed okay with that.
Sure.
And Nazi Germany is the opposite, extremely aggressive, right? Never doesn't know when to stop. Yeah. Like if Hitler had not invaded the Soviet Union, they might have won the war. But he couldn't stop himself, right? And that's the opposite extreme. And I'd say most authoritarians fall somewhere in between.
Sure.
I would say Putin, we don't really know, you can't know this. You can't read their minds. And even they don't really know, if Putin actually succeeded in taking all of Ukraine, which I don't think he will anytime soon. Why would he stop then? Might he continue into Moldova and Poland and the Baltics? That's the fear. If you live in Poland or Estonia, maybe Finland, but we don't really know. We don't know the answer, but it's awfully risky. Eventually I think Russia is such a, frankly, internally weak country. It couldn't take over the world. And, China's also got a stake in that. But Russia is expansionist, clearly. That became so clear. Actually, in 2014. And so,
I was just gonna say, it feels like there's two things happening in Russia, or related to Russia, at least from what I've seen. Because Europe, I think about like Germany is sort of on the green kick or whatever, like going green and things like that, and they're getting rid of they have gotten rid of a lot of their power supply.
The nuclear,
Right, exactly. And then they start to import from Russia. So now they're dependent upon Russia. Yeah. And so there's this, I think this is why people are frustrated with the idea of liberalism generally, which I don't agree with them, because I think you have to make distinctions between positive and negative liberty. And so there's like an implosion happening in Europe in certain areas. And then Russia, though they might not be the most sophisticated country in the world, like at least they have power. And so if they wanted to expand, they certainly could do that. And if the West is reliant upon authoritarian regimes like Russia for their power, then they really lose a lot of their own influence and a lot of their own political power in the West. And I think that's some of maybe what people have been getting frustrated with in the isolationist end is like, it seems like liberalism's imploding in the West.
Yeah.
And I actually agree with that.
Yeah.
But the answer isn't to then create, like you said earlier, isn't to create like a fascist government or a communist government or something like that. It's to actually restore a positive liberty, which we could talk about. But anyways, sorry to interrupt. That's
fine. It's a domestic. I'm certainly on board. Domestic politics and international politics are linked. You can separate them in your head, but in practice, they're very linked.
Yeah.
And the Germans and the Europeans in general, I think especially the Germans, made a really bad strategic error in pinning so much of their economic future to Russian energy. And they know that. And I think the new chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is much smarter about this.
Hopefully.
And, one good outcome of American, signaling to the Europeans, we may not defend you guys. You can't count on us the way you used to, is they are starting to spend more on their militaries. Every U.S. president since the 1960s has been pushing them. Nobody as hard as Trump, but they've all kind of been, upset or at least annoyed that the Europeans free ride to the extent they do. And the Europeans, and I'm in Canada, Canadians too. Yeah, we know this is a problem, but we'll take care of it. We can't do it now. We can't take care of it now, but don't worry, like next year, the year after. It never happens. Now it's happening. So good, good for Trump for forcing this on them. And I think this is just healthy for Europe, and because they are quite worried, especially the further east you go in Europe, about Russia.
Yeah,
they just don't know when it's going to stop. They worry about Russia and China becoming even closer allies, and the Americans saying, "Well, you know what, you guys are on your own. Sorry." They really do think about. I was in Portugal in early June, and there were a lot of other Europeans there, not just Portuguese. And they were thinking about this a lot, asking me about what's going to happen, what's America up to, and I said, I'm not completely sure, but here's what I'm seeing.
Right.
So they're stepping up and starting to defend themselves, but they also adhere to this full notion of national interest. We don't just want Russia not to invade us. We want to remain stable, constitutional democracies. We've had soldiers die, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, some of them die for this regime. And so have you Americans. And we think this is really in our national interest. Yeah.
Sure. No, that makes sense. I mean, there's like a million different directions that we could go. I just want to say one thing about, you had talked about the 1920s and leading into the 1930s in the United States and the Great Depression. And then coming out of that, people started to kind of flirt with authoritarian, or I guess with communism and fascism, and saying, well, liberalism doesn't work, democracy doesn't work. I might be totally wrong about the history here, but is the Great Depression was in some sense a result of people taking on too much credit and debt, correct? And not being able to pay that back. Is that part of? Yeah.
I mean, it's complicated. Yes, there was an over leveraged economy, and all these economies, as in 2008, much more recently, were interdependent. Yeah. And so some banks failed, and investors lost confidence in the economy and began to sell off stocks in a hurry. This is a long time ago, before we had the internet or anything like that. Yeah. It's a bunch of guys with slips of paper running around like you see in the movies. The real beginning was a stock market crash on Wall Street in October 1929.
What's interesting to me is that I see parallels to our current time, is in that people, and tell me what you think about this, people will do and like anything to not take personal responsibility. Like to me, it's like, okay, if we're taking on more debt than we can handle, and I mean, it was part of the housing crisis in 2008. I know that there were systematic failures and there's a lot of corruption in that situation as well. But at some point we have to say to people, you shouldn't take on a mortgage that you can't afford. You shouldn't like build up a bunch of debt that you can't actually pay off on an individual level. And then people sort of just shift. And I think this is happening in the United States right now on the far right. They're saying, because we're seeing all of these different sort of chaotic issues in the social imaginary, the way to stabilize that and structure that is not through personal responsibility or just repentance or whatever words you want to use. It's just through putting in an authoritarian regime. And like, I'm generally, I like Trump. I think he's done a decent job. That said, I can see the tendency of the far right now going towards authoritarianism and flirting with that idea because they think that liberalism has failed, when in reality, I think that we've failed as a country in our moral obligation, sort of what Tocqueville, talks about. America is great because America is good, and when she ceases to be good, she'll cease to be great.
Yeah.
There's no morality, and there's no sort of, we need to take some responsibility for the very bad decisions we've made economically, morally, politically throughout the past 60 years. No one wants to have that conversation, and it creates this isolationist, paranoid, weird like time that we live in, where I'm like, I don't know what the world's going to look like in 5 years. So what do you think about that? Is that an accurate assessment?
Yes, I think a big part of our problem is you can sum it up in the word decadence. Ross Douthat, the New York Times columnist, has a book on decadence. And it's about more than just what you're talking about. But
sure.
Yeah, we're just to put it in fiscal terms, I think the fiscal and the kind of personal and social morality are related. Yeah. But, historically, so I'm old enough to remember when the Republican Party was really the party of fiscal responsibility. Mm-hmm. It didn't favor high government spending, and it didn't favor high taxes, but it did favor balanced budgets. Yeah. And the Democratic Party was the party of deficit spending, and meaning high government spending and raise taxes, Keynesian economic theory and so on. Yeah. So the tug of war is back and forth between the Democrats who ran up budget deficits and the Republicans who tried to balance the budget. Those days are long gone. Yeah. Neither party is fiscally responsible. We don't have a party of fiscal responsibility. You have a few, cranky seeming people in Congress, a few in the media, Wall Street,
Elon Musk is pissed at Trump because of this exact issue. Trump promised to balance the budget, and he's just doing the same thing. Now, the argument that the conservatives will make as well, he's shifting money and spending it, and he's defunding Planned Parenthood and things like, and I'm fine with that. I like that. I don't want Planned Parenthood to have any money. I think they're a terrible institution, but I don't want us to be spending that much money because that's just going to continue to, we think that we can indefinitely kick the can down the road forever. Yeah. And that's what do you think is going to happen because of that?
Well, I mean, I think it's more, I hate to say more a problem for your generation than mine, I think there are people maybe in the administration who have this theory that tariffs will make up for in terms of federal revenue. And, most economists say no, because they also slow economic growth a bit. All else equal, they'll do that. It may be that mainstream economists are too hostile toward tariffs. There's, some who say, a few tariffs could be good, but I haven't found any reputable economist who says, it's okay because tariffs will make up the revenue and we'll balance the budget. Nobody's talking about that. So I think you're right. And I think, look, somebody's going to have to pay at some point, maybe pretty soon. So I'm not an economist, but I get worried when the national debt exceeds the defense budget, payments on the debt. I should say payments on the debt are now a bigger budget item than the military budget. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's kind of an artificial index, but we've never been here before. Okay, and we have to recognize that when you're paying that much interest on your debt, it does limit what you can do. Yes. And then interest rates could go up and the cost of borrowing, you can enter this doom spiral where the cost of borrowing goes up. Mm-hmm. And, this is something we're doing to ourselves. Yeah. So why is that? Why don't we have a party of fiscal responsibility anymore? I don't know, but I think, of course, the American people, like any people, would love to have a free lunch. I would. if there's some way to have all this good stuff without paying for it, sign me up.
Right.
But we've always had politicians who at the end of the day say, we actually can't. We're going to have to raise taxes, or we can cut, this service and maybe we'll have to cut Social Security or Medicare, but we're going to have to cut something. Yeah. Very few are willing to say that anymore. No. So part of it's courage, I think. Part of it maybe, social media and the whole media environment where it's very hard to give bad news. You get shouted down, you get outnumbered by the mob who says, that's wrong. And, how dare you and that kind of thing. Yeah. That's probably part of it too. But I think we're in trouble, and it's self-inflicted. This is what's most troubling to me. And we don't seem able to fix it.
No. Well, do you think that has to do with the financial problems? Has anything to do with the Nixon 1971 taking us off the gold standard? Money in the United States is sort of arbitrarily backed by the United States government, which I know we will talk about geopolitics. I just think all these things are sort of connected in some way, because I'm 25 and I've got two kids with a third on the way. And so where this is going,
no, you gotta think about this. Yeah. Right. So I don't think it was that Nixon so-called closing the gold window, because if you look at fiscal history since then, you have Reagan, ironically, from the party of fiscal responsibility, decided, we need to do some things. We have to win the Cold War. So you're going to spend a lot of money in the military temporarily to bankrupt the Soviets. It worked, but it ran up some big deficits. And then in the 90s, thanks to George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and I was not a fan of Clinton on the whole, but, these guys reined in spending and raised taxes just enough. And so by the mid-90s, we were running a surplus.
Wow.
Well after Nixon closed the gold window. And then that's 9/11 kind of put the kibosh on that, and we started spending more. And it's been off to the races ever since. So Obama, and then the first Trump administration, and then certainly the Biden administration, and now the Trump administration with the big, beautiful bill. You can look at these depressing graphs about the budget deficit and see. But it wasn't that, so I'm old enough to remember the 90s pretty well, and we had a surplus. And the question was, how are we going to spend? Wow, what do we do with this surplus? What a great problem, but it's a problem. Yeah. So Republicans wanted to cut taxes and give it back to the people. Democrats wanted to spend it, but it was a different world back then.
Yes. Yeah. Now it just seems like we are in a power game where both sides are just trying to grab as much power, spend as much as they can. And that seems like a dangerous place to be in. So going back to, I actually want to talk about the Middle East and Israel and Iran, because I think this is the hot topic of the last, what Trump's calling it the 12-day war. I don't know if it was actually 12 days, because the next day they had some conflicts, but then it's 12 or 13-day war, whatever we want to call it.
A baker's dozen. Yeah.
Right. That's true. There was, and I kind of fell into it a little bit because I tried to follow this as best as I could, the whole entire conflict from the beginning. There was a lot of skepticism from the right in the United States backing Israel. Yeah. But in reality, Israel's military capacity was limited. They didn't have the bombs that we had that could take out these facilities that were deep in the ground. Right. And so they wouldn't have been able to get to these facilities. And it was reported, again, I don't know how to verify this, that Iran was weeks, months, I don't know, a year away from having nuclear capacity, nuclear weapons. And so we are in this, what felt like a really difficult situation. I feel like Trump was in a difficult situation because his people, the people who voted for him, the Republican Party, which is this massive coalition right now, which it was to beat Kamala Harris, a massive coalition, started to fracture, and everybody's starting to disagree on this issue of Israel. And so I think there's a bunch of different factors here. I think one of them is religious. I think one of them is obviously just the geopolitics, the nature of how things work in the geopolitical world and what you were just describing before. But can you just kind of walk me through what your thought process was as these events began to unfold between Iran and Israel? And were you in favor of the United States backing Israel and even going so far as to attack Iran? Or what was your take during this?
I was, although it wasn't an easy call.
Sure.
Because it's dangerous. Let's see. Israel, first of all, Israel in its war that against, first of all, Hamas, then Hezbollah, and kind of indirectly against Iran, has done brilliantly. I want to say that, and this is not. I am very, very troubled by the brutality inflicted on Gaza and Palestinians in Gaza. I think it's horrible. I've got some complaints about how Israel did it, but just speaking strategically, and as someone who just generally backs Israel, I'm more impressed than ever at the prowess, both military and intelligence. That so-called Grim Beeper trick they pulled on Hezbollah in Lebanon was amazing.
I got to ask because if you say you back Israel, you're not receiving any money from Israel.
No, that's right.
The argument.
No, I am not. No, I'm not. No, I asked them, but they don't pay guys like that.
Yeah, they don't pay very good. Okay, gotcha.
Right. But let's see. So what this means geopolitically is Iran really has been weakened by Israel, and by that I mean Iran, directly had shown. So Iran had fired missiles a couple of times during the war against Hamas, and they really didn't do much. Israel has this Iron Dome that can shoot them down. So Iran kind of learned, well, our missiles aren't going to really do that much. But maybe more importantly, Iran's proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, were defeated militarily by Israel. And also the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad, which was an Iranian client, was overthrown. We still don't have the full story. Probably the Turks announced a third party helped accomplish that. But Iran 2 years ago had Syria in its pocket, a lot of influence in Iraq, and it had control or great influence over Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. And most of that's disappeared. So meanwhile, they still have their nuclear program. So if you're sitting in Jerusalem and you're thinking, well, for years we've seen Iran as the biggest threat. If we're ever going to attack them, it's got to be now. They're not going to be this weak forever. Right. And the world already hates us. There's nothing to be done about that. The UN. If you're already hated, why not do it? Right. So I think that was a calculus in Jerusalem. This puts a difficult choice on whoever the U.S. president is. Israel is not a formal ally. This surprises people. We have no formal treaty with Israel, but everyone knows we're an ally and we supply them with all kinds, and they help us with intel and, scientific and military cooperation and so on. So I think that my sense is the Trump people were also impressed at how weak Iran was. And we'll know the full story someday, but when Israel did as much as it could to eliminate or weaken Iran's nuclear program, which, by the way, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA in Vienna, an arm of the UN, said a few weeks ago, Iran was on the road to a nuclear weapon. It kind of restarted its acceleration of uranium, fissile material. So that's not Trump talking or Israel. That's the United Nations.
What do you make of those sorts of claims? Because I have a hard time with this. Obviously, in Iraq, we heard for a long time they were on the verge of a nuclear weapon, and I think that's where a lot of the skepticism came from. The far right was, well, we've seen this before, and it just became a forever war. And we spent all of our money, and people died.
That's right.
And I think that's a legitimate fear. I don't want to just say that those people are irrational, but what do you make of that?
Yeah, it is legitimate. I will say that the Iraq, before that disaster with Iraq. The opposite happened. We thought Saddam Hussein of Iraq didn't have a nuclear program, in the 80s, and he did. And so the Intel's just a very difficult business, right? We can never be sure we're getting it right. You do the best you can. It's pretty clear to me that the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, made the wrong call, overinterpreted some evidence. There may have been some shenanigans going on with what's called Team B, Intel, which is, we don't like what the CIA is telling us, so let's try again. Let's come up with our own report. Yeah. Some of that. I don't know, but the fact that the IAEA said, yeah, Iran looks to us like they're accelerating the program, that's independent corroboration, right?
Sure.
And so while I understand the objection as you do, I think in this case it was, and given Iran's weakness, and given that okay, let me back up and say this. Iran claims that it's enriching uranium for a civilian nuclear program. But as far as I know, there's no civilian nuclear program in Iran, right? It seems like they would have had some nuclear power plants by now. Right. They've been doing this for 20 odd years, nothing. And so it looks to a lot of us who analyze this stuff, Iran has been trying to keep its options open, right? Yeah. It wants to be able to move to nuclear warheads pretty quickly if it has to, but it also doesn't want to provoke Israel and the United States. So it's kind of been in this uncomfortable middle position.
And on top of that, Russia seemed to pull support pretty quickly from Iran, which
that's right.
Is sort of a backstop for what Iran probably thought was a sort of an ally or a friend that could potentially help them out here. But Putin was out of there like 5 seconds.
He's got other things to worry about. Yeah. I mean, but you see what kind of friend he is. Yeah. So anyway, bringing it back to your initial question, I think I accept that Iran, which has always talked like a threat to Israel, wipe Israel off the map and so on, and has had these proxies. Hezbollah had thousands and thousands of rockets pointed at Israel. It's certainly a threat on any reasonable measure, and it's weak, but it's still got its nuclear program. It has incentives actually to accelerate its nuclear program. And the IAEA says, yep, it looks like to us it's doing it. On balance, I favor what the Trump administration did. Yes. Given that, as best we could tell, these so-called bunker busting, about 30,000 pound, they could do the job. If anything could do the job, it's those. The Israelis, you're right, couldn't do it. They maybe could have tried it with special forces, but that's really, really hard to do. They'd already penetrated Iran to the point where the Iranian government is starting to find spies and kill them, people working for Israel. So it's going to be very hard to put people on the ground, Israeli agents, to take out the Fordo. Right. So it seems like this was the right way to go. It's not an easy call. I'm not gung-ho for this, but I think on balance, even setting Iran back by a few years is a good thing. Buys us some more time. Right. And so that's where I come down on that one.
Yeah. Well, I was listening closely to, I was listening on the right, on the conservative side of things or whatever. Some of these people aren't conservative, but I was listening to Ben Shapiro, who seemed to have a more level-headed approach to this whole entire conflict. Of course, his interest is with Israel because he's a Jew. Sure. And then and he's got family and things like that over there. But then you had guys like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, and then you get into like the really, Alex Joneses of the world and things like that. I was trying to follow all of this. And I felt like Shapiro kind of had the best take on it. A lot of similar things to what you were saying, but there was this paranoia from Tucker and from Candace and from Matt Walsh and these people who were very isolationist, because I think they were just fundamentally convinced that if the United States goes in and they drop these bombs, it's going to start a forever war in Iran. And they were sort of equivocating and saying Iran and Iraq, it's the same exact situation. Nothing's different. And then they get into all their catastrophic views of World War III. And I understand where they're coming from, but this seems to be deeply ideological. There seems to be like a deep because we can continue to talk about some of the surface level, what actually happened and whether these decisions should have been made. But at the core of the problem, there's ideological differences as to how you should, I guess, exist on a globe as a sovereign nation like the United States. And to be completely honest with you, as the global empire, I mean, we're the largest empire in the world. I don't know if we want to use the language of empire, but we're the largest nation in the world, and we have a lot of say and influence. We have the biggest military, and we kind of control what goes on in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so what I was surprised by, one, do you think that this is at the core sort of a religious, ideological battle rather than just like a merely geographical military? What do you think is happening at the core of this entire conflict? Is it religious or ideological, or what is it?
You mean between Israel and Iran, or the Middle East? Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me say, first of all, on something you said a minute ago. Yeah. I should add, I didn't think the risk of World War III was very high at all. It's not zero, but I would have been absolutely shocked if Russia or China had backed Iran on this. It's like, why would they do that? And you're right. Putin just said, good luck. I'm busy. I got other things to worry about.
Yeah.
And so I figured that was the case. Israel has maybe 200 nuclear warheads. Is Iran going to attack them? No. Plus the United States. Absolutely not. They want Iran wants the United States out of the Persian Gulf. But it can't do much to do that except these little pinpricks, right? So I think you're right. There was a lot of alarmism on the parts of the right and parts of the left who said we shouldn't be doing this. But I know, most of us who study this didn't take that seriously. So as to what's really going on in the Middle East, why does Israel have these enemies? So I want to be careful and say it's not Islam per se versus Judaism per se, because there are Islamic majority Muslim countries that do not want to throw Israel into the sea, or at least they certainly don't act that way. And I'll start with Saudi Arabia, which is not an ally of Israel by any means, but it's coming close to establishing relations. The first Trump administration brokered this Abraham Accord between the United Arab Emirates, which is a small neighbor of Saudi Arabia, and Israel. So they have mutual relations. And Saudi Arabia is kind of watching under Trump 1 and saying, maybe we could do that.
Where does Qatar play in all of this?
Yeah. So, Qatar.
Okay.
Right.
Because look, I don't know if this
spoiler. I mean, the Saudis suspect the Qataris of being a little bit too close to Iran. If you look at the map, these Arab monarchies are right across the Persian Gulf, or maybe we're supposed to say the Arabian Gulf now. I don't know, from Iran.
Sure.
And so geopolitically, they're going to be rivals. They're going to have trouble. They're both want to control. Or each thinks the other wants to control this vital body of water through which 1/3 of the world's oil supply comes from.
Right?
All right. So Saudi Arabia would like all the Arab monarchies in the southern shore of the Persian Gulf to be with it. It's the big country. Yeah. And Qatar sometimes is, maybe not. We're pretty rich too, actually. So, that it's been hard for the Saudis. But Egypt and Jordan are two other countries that have made their peace with Israel.
Yes.
And so Iran has been a peculiarly militant anti-Israel country. So we want to probe why that is. And so Iran has a particular Islamically inflected ideology, let's call it. And it's not the only actor in the region with an ideology that makes it particularly anti-Israel. Al-Qaeda, ISIS. Right. Iran is different from those guys. It's a Shia country. It has from a different branch of Islam, and has a very different theory of governance. It's actually a republic, Iran. It's not a monarchy. Okay. But behind the republic, behind the parliament, is this Ayatollah Khamenei, who has a lot of political power. He gets to say, that candidate or that political party is heretical. They can't run. Whoops, too bad for you. So the elections aren't really free and fair.
Right.
But it is a republic. It has elected government. The elections are competitive but they're quite, they have built the regime since 1979. They've been in power since 1979 on these ideas about America as the great Satan and Israel is kind of a proxy for America. And these are, wicked satanic presences in our region. They don't belong here. Israel's sort of like a little arm of the United States. And it's very, very anti-Semitic. The Jews control everything and et cetera, et cetera.
Is that primarily religious because of the radical Islamic bent?
I mean, they put it in Islamic language. Again, a lot of Muslims don't think that way about. I mean, I will say, the countries I've mentioned, you see a lot of anti-Semitism, believe me, in Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Believe me. But it's not the official. It doesn't drive foreign policy nearly as much. These countries, these other countries are fine living at peace with Israel. Israel's here to stay. We have to accept it and get along with them and, maybe trade with them and so on. Iran is.
And even Egypt. Didn't Egypt sort of turn away certain, was it from Palestine? I can't remember. I might be wrong about this, but even Egypt sort of turned away some immigrants or, people.
Coming from Gaza. They don't want people flooding into their territory from Gaza because a lot of those guys are Hamas militants. They don't want them in Egypt, right? Stay where you are. Yeah. Right. And you got to pay attention. Saudi Arabia doesn't want these people. Somebody in the Trump administration said, well, why don't we get people out of Gaza and rebuild Gaza? And where can we put them in Saudi Arabia? So I said, wait, time out. No. We don't want Hamas people here. It's not our problem, actually. So, so it's religious in the sense, Andy, that the Iranian regime puts it in terms of religious language. Yeah. Right. The great Satan but I want to be clear. If you can be Muslim and not accept that particular take or that kind of language about the Jews or about Israel, and even if you are, anti-Semitic, and I have to say it's a big problem in all over the world, but certainly in the Middle East, anti-Semitism, you still don't have to say, well, we should drive Israel into the sea. They're our permanent enemy, and wherever you encounter a Jew, you have a duty to kill him and all that. Most Muslims say, no, that's ridiculous. That's crazy, right? We got to be pragmatic here. So Iran is a particularly motivated, virulent regime. So I guess I would say, just as within Christianity, if you look at Christian history, you've had periods when certain denominations have been quite militant and others have been kind of, live and let live for now, at least. So going back 400, 500 years, the Lutherans and the Reformed, the Calvinists in Europe, the Lutherans by the 1550s, 60s, 70s were kind of living at peace with the Roman Catholics. Yeah. The Calvinists were not. They were really militant. They were breaking up icons and overthrowing monarchs. And so the Lutherans began to look at the Calvinists and say, we actually kind of prefer the Catholics because at least they're not busting things up and causing revolutions. Right. They're all Christian. They're all Protestant, but they're so it's kind of like that. Iran is, if I may draw, I hope this isn't offensive. I find it slightly offensive myself, but to draw an analogy between the Calvinists in the 1560s and 70s and the Iranians now, it's a wing of a religion that, for whatever reason, is particularly militant, but hasn't always been and someday won't be. Just for the sake of clarity, the Calvinists, they weren't killing any. I mean, everybody. I'm afraid everybody was doing some of that, but they were making war. But war was being made on them. Nobody's innocent in that picture. The Calvinists were revolutionary, and I think our country has benefited from that revolutionary impulse. Right, its descendants were some of the people who helped us break away from England. But this idea, if you're living under an unjust government, I mean, it's a very complicated story. And it is. Yes. And I'm not casting moral judgment. If anything, again, I appreciate the Calvinist heritage. But it's just a point about who is really militant in using violence and who's not.
Yes. Yeah, totally. Totally. No, that's one of the difficulties with, I mean, obviously it's one of the difficulties with religion and ideologies and the sacred texts and things like that. Cause when you read, even in the Bible, if you interpret things if you take a wrong term and turn in your hermeneutic or interpretation, whatever, you can end up in places that are very, very dangerous, that, sort of seem to contradict, at least for Christianity, some of the core principles, the core doctrines, loving your neighbor and like, don't just like kill people if you disagree with them,
right.
and things like that, and then on the other hand, you can get into this place where I think where liberalism has taken us and the Lutheran Church is at right now in a lot of places, where it's like accepting of every ideology and everything all the time. And now you're accepting of things that are objectively against Scripture, and there's this weird middle. Anyways, all that to say, I'm sure that happens.
ELCA is having troubles. I hear about that. Yeah,
right. I mean, it's happening all over, and I'm sure that that's happening in Islam. I've never read the Quran. I've heard negative things about the Quran and what it says, and I obviously don't agree with the religion. But there obviously are people in the Middle East who are Islam or are Muslim, and they don't want to kill every single Jew. They tolerate the Jews or whatever. So there's a spectrum, let's just say, I don't know, a spectrum of aggression in religion, I suppose. Yeah.
There's a long-standing debate about this. So, some say Islam is just kind of set up for violence, and it doesn't. Sure. It's very hard for pious, sincere Muslims to live in, say, a constitutional democracy, because their religion requires them to impose, the Islamic law on everyone. I don't know. I'm not a Muslim either. I have read a lot of the Quran. It's very long. And parts of it are very strange. Parts of it are familiar to Christians. It's kind of picking up on some of the Old and New Testaments and supposedly correcting them, Muslims say. But
sure.
I just know empirically, it was a matter, you look out at the world, there are a lot of people who are, I'm convinced, believing Muslims who don't accept that at all. That God, Allah wants us to live in peace with our neighbors in this Western secular society, and that's just the way it is. So I spent about half of year 2024 in England, and my wife and I lived in a neighborhood with lots of Muslims, lots of people from Pakistan and Bangladesh, immigrants. And, I'm sure there are societal problems. This is East Oxford.
Yeah. Okay.
But, we didn't witness any violence. These are people who are living at peace with their neighbors, and there are a lot of mosques. They're going to Friday night prayer service, a lot of them. And so just as an empirical matter, I think it's wrong to say all Muslims are violent or it's a violent religion per se. It certainly has elements of that in it. But you can also say, I say as a political scientist, most of the world's big religions have had times and places where the faithful were quite militant and even violent. And then the majority of times and places, they're not that way.
Can I ask you this? Because this is, it seems to me that whether religious or atheistic, I mean, if you go into, the Nazi regime wasn't inherently religious. It was sort of rationalism taken to its conclusion in some sense.
But anti-Christian.
So, anti-Christian, anti-Jew. I mean, they changed the Bibles. They put swastikas where the crosses were, and apparently the German church couldn't figure out if that should we do that or not. Definitely shouldn't do that. There seems to be one common thread, though, even with Luther back when he couldn't convince the Jews to convert to Christianity. He got kind of crazy. I mean, if you read some of the stuff he said, burn their homes down and things like that. I mean, he went off the rails. There's this hatred for the Jews across all of these. And whether across all of these ideologies, when you go too far into, people want to call it fundamentalism. I don't know exactly what we could call it, because I like to, fundamental. I like the idea that there's fundamentals of the faith and that we should hold true to those fundamentals. So whatever, but whatever we call it, there's this hatred for the Jews. And that's where things started to get a little bit weird on the political right in the United States. Even people who I thought were conservative who for the last 10 years have been sort of on the side of generally conservative values started to be like pro-Iran, have been pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas, things like that have been very confusing. And there's one uniting factor, which is they just don't like the Jews. I think that it has to do with the ethnicity, and the ethnicity being tied to the ethnicity of Christ, and the Jews being sort of a physical remnant of Christ, and there being some sort of when people see the Jews, they see Christ, and because I'm a Calvinist, because we're depraved, we don't like Christ. Anyways, you can disagree with that or agree with that if you want to.
Yeah.
What do you think why is it that even if it's religion, it's the Jews, and in authoritarian, sort of atheistic, rationalistic ideology, and that takes it to a conclusion, they also hate the Jews? What do you think it is about the Jews that people are just frustrated with and hate?
It's a deep question.
Yeah.
I want to say, first of all, sometimes I think to myself, I cannot believe that anti-Semitism is resurgent now. I know. On the far left and the far right. And because I remember as a kid, I'm a lot older, watching, I was up late watching PBS when my parents didn't know. And I watched this footage of, it looked like bulldozers, black and white grainy footage, bulldozers pushing what looked like, I kept looking, is that dead bodies? Like 100 dead bodies? What in the world? I was I was too young to be watching this stuff, but it was, turns out it was a documentary that I recommend, The World at War, came out in the 70s, made by the BBC. You can find it on, usual places, but anyway. And, so, I remember talking and learning about this and thinking, well, thank God that was then and we're past it. We can never forget, but we live in a different world and we're never going to go back there. And sure, there's not that vast Holocaust. But what happened? What Hamas did to Israel in October 2023, is a small scale version. This ruthless brutality, showing no mercy at all. A genocidal impulse is back. And meanwhile, you're right. There are people who I thought knew better, who are just flirting with, and not just flirting with, adopting some anti-Semitic tropes. So I just want to say that this has been, I'm having to adjust to the 2020s when this is back. And
it's horrifying. It's like actually terrifying because there's a lot of, I was just listening through and reading about Bonhoeffer and leading up to the rise of Hitler and what the church was like. Even in the church in the United States, there's a lot of similarities, to be completely honest with you, with the German church right before the Third Reich and everything that happened with Hitler. It's just horrifying to me. And I don't even know how to get it across to people that this rise on the right and the left of Jew hatred is indicative of something that's really, really sinister and dark. And if we don't put it down now, it's going to cause catastrophe.
It is demonic. And you're right that it sort of shape shifts in the sense that there have been periods, say medieval Europe, where anti-Semitism was religiously based. It was, these are Christ killers and they don't, and they all these myths about how they kill children and drink their blood and so on. And their religious rituals. The Nazis were different. They had a racial theory, which is empirically completely false, but that the human race is divided. The human race is divided into races that are in this competition, and the Jews are particularly nefarious, and it just have to be. They're holding the Germans down, and they have to be eliminated.
Rooted in Darwinism. I know people, rooted in. I mean, I was reading Herman Bavinck today, The Wonderful Works of God, and he's going through the Darwinian the argument and evolutionary argument, and it really sort of ends. If you take it to its rational conclusion, the way that the Nazis did, they end thinking, yes, the white, blonde hair, blue eyed, that is the sort of supreme man. Right. And it's very dark stuff. Anyways,
that's right.
Sorry. Go ahead.
And there's a third. So we have religious, racial, racial in scare quotes. And then maybe the most robust theory about the Jews upon which anti-Semitism is based is that they control everything. They control the banks and the businesses and the universities and entertainment. And how can this be? Well, they must be conspiring Maybe they're just unusually brilliant or capable, but it's probably that there's a conspiracy. They help each other, this chosen people thing. And so, and they're elites and they're messing things up, and so on. So that's a third. And sometimes these are all muddled, like the racial and the religious and they control everything theses are all kind of mixed up together. But we can kind of separate them out. And now I think it's the third that's doing a lot of the work. That there's this theory that's still around that the Jews control everything. They're pulling strings. And so Israel tricked the United States into bombing Iran. They did it again, those Jews. And whatever form it takes. So, we're left with this puzzle. How come? Well, what is it? This is your question. What is it about the Jews that we keep shape-shifting anti-Semitism? We put it on a different footing, but it's always there. There's something really strange about that. And I don't know. There may be a theological answer that you're touching on with what the Jews remind Christians of. But it's not just Christians who are anti-Semitic. You said you said a minute ago, Muslims, and also the far left has some, with its sympathy for Hamas in some quarters is there. And that's not a religious objection. I think it's more the Jews are rich and they control everything theory. And so, they trick everyone. So, I don't know the answer. I just know we need to call this out like you're doing, identify it, examine our own language and practices, not be afraid of criticism, right? We need to be open to questions. But I'm confident that anti-Semitism is based on a bunch of myths. They're very powerful myths. Yeah. But they're false. And so we don't need to be afraid of anti-Semitism. We just need to engage it.
Right. One of the scary things about one of the myths that you mentioned, that the Jews are the Christ killers. One of the problems with that is that so were the Gentiles, so was Pilate. So there's just a sort of disregard for very clear things in the gospel that are like anti-human nature. Like human nature is what compelled people to murder Christ, regardless of ethnicity and skin color. The Jews matter, don't get me wrong, and they're God's chosen people. But the idea that they're the Jew killers, Pontius Pilate made the first postmodern state. Well, what is truth? He starts playing that game, and So, anyways, you're
right. You're absolutely right. I mean, you're doing good theology there, and there's an old Lutheran hymn I like. Ah, Holy Jesus. You sing it during Lent, and it's I'll get the words wrong, but it's one of the verses ends. Who was the guilty? Who brought this upon thee? Alas, my treason. My treason, Jesus hath undone thee. And the last line of that verse is, 'twas I denied thee, I crucified thee. Mm-hmm. So not the Jews, but everybody, including me, because of my sin, it put him on the cross. So that's good theology. Not the Jews did it.
Right. Amen. I totally agree. I'll let me ask just one quick question, then I'll let you go. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So just with what Trump and the administration did, as far as their military, the strategy that I felt like that it was a great military feat. Basically, they went in there, they did what they had to do, they took out the facilities, and then they were done. And they sort of did what they said that they were going to do. They didn't drag it on. It really discredited a lot of these people, these frantic isolationists on the far right. It certainly, was the far left doesn't really like anything that Trump does ever. So it's hard to take them seriously. What was your reaction after the bombs were dropped? It was a success in military terms. It was a successful mission, and we aren't in a forever war right now, as far as I can tell, in the Middle East.
Yes, agreed. We still don't know the full extent of the damage or how far back this set Iran, and we're in the process, right? So you hear reports, and people want to spin this and leak information. That either it was a complete success, and President Trump likes the word obliterated, or it hardly did anything. This leaked DIA preliminary report said that. The truth's probably somewhere in between, but we don't know. And this is all part of the process. Good intelligence takes signals intelligence into account, including pictures. It takes a number of sources. If you have human sources who can, and again, Israel has some people on the ground in Iran, that we know. who can report. But it's clear to me. So if it had zero effect, I would have thought, well, that was not good.
Yeah.
If it completely obliterated, as the president has claimed, that would be great.
Yeah.
Again, it's probably somewhere in between. It was clearly a successful mission in the sense that there were no U.S. casualties. It was pulled off in secret. All the bombs were on target, as far as we've heard. Right. Very impressive show of force. And it also shows that the Trump administration and the United States in general are willing to do this. It's not just this time we mean it. Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. Actually, next time we're going to mean it. No.
Yeah.
So all that is useful as a signal. And on balance, I think it was the right call. And again, I never took the World War III threat particularly seriously. I just didn't see a path to World War III. How does that work? How do we get to World War III from this? As long as this is an isolated mission, like hit them very hard and get out of there. Why would American boots need to go on the ground? I suppose if you really believe that the Trump administration wants to do regime change and overthrow the Iranian regime with the U.S. Marines, sure, I would oppose that. Yeah. Even though I'm for supporting democracy abroad, as you know.
Yeah.
You have to be prudent about it. That would be a really foolish thing to do. We've learned from Iraq and Afghanistan that's much harder than we thought. And Iran has a lot more people. It's a bigger country than either of those.
Yeah.
So we'd be in for a long time and would probably fail. But that's not what I don't know any American who wants to do that, any American leader who wants to do that. So,
and it brought about a ceasefire, I think, which is still in place.
Still
and
seems to hold.
They're kind of working things out. Hopefully they come to some sort of negotiation or peace. But yeah, I agree. I think that there was fear that they would go and try to do a regime change, and that probably wouldn't have worked out too well, and it would have sort of affirmed what some of these people were saying, which I think would have caused more issues. One interesting thing, and then I'll wrap it up, was, and I have no clue if this is true, and this could be a total whatever, but Axios, I think, reported that people like Tucker Carlson were receiving funds from Qatar, who had put on a big campaign to basically push a particular sort of narrative in the United States related to some of these things. I don't know if that's true. I mean, Axios put it out. Who knows? If it is true, that sort of leads to a lot of different conversations related to social media and how people think through things, and whether or not you can control entire swaths of people with false information and bots and things like that, which I think is a fascinating conversation. But the last month, I think has proved that there's a lot of instability in the United States, and even within the Republican Party. That whole big tent, we need to beat the Democrats thing worked, and I think it was necessary to beat Kamala. I don't think she would have been a good president.
Yeah,
but now you've got all these factions within the Republican Party, and they seem to be vehemently against each other. And it's hard to tell what the path forward is for the Republicans, and the Democrats don't know what the path forward is. They seem to be out of their mind right now in a lot of ways. And so who's going to be the leader? I don't know. Just makes me nervous.
Buckle up. Well, we're all buckled up already. Keep your seat belt buckled. Yeah. I saw a poll that a majority, maybe 3 out of 4 Republican voters are, in retrospect, at least for what Trump did. The attack on the Iran. But elites, you're right. The elites are divided. I know they don't like being called elites, but Tucker Carlson. I'm sorry, he's an elite.
He's
are against it and hoping this is a one-off and so on. And sure, I agree with them in the sense, just this far, that I would hate it if Donald Trump got a taste for this and said, well, wow, since we have the best Air Force in the world, there's some other targets I can think of. Why don't we go after Kim Jong-un in North Korea, or Russia, China? No, that's not going to happen. That's not how. I don't think so. Nobody who's I don't think anyone who's going to be elected U.S. president is going to be that foolish. Right. They're going to be weeded out of the system before they make president. And that goes for Donald Trump. I think he's his default really is to be a broker of peace agreements. He apparently wants a Nobel Peace Prize. I'm not sure that the Norwegians will ever give him one, but that's a noble impulse to want to be a peacemaker. Right. So
I think he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize if it was actually what it stood for the Abraham Accords, and maybe for this Iran-Israel thing. But we'll see. They won't ever give him one.
I have a feeling they won't. But yeah.
He'll make his own like Trump Peace Award or something. That's what he usually does.
Right. Yeah.
No, anyways, I thank you for taking time to talk. Like, this is very helpful. I think the conversation around geopolitics is complicated. It's not that we can't understand it, but there's a lot of moving parts, and the sort of thing that I think people on the right want to do is simplify it down to, well, let's just not talk about anything across the ocean, and it's all about what's happening here. And I think that that's short-sighted, and it can cause a lot of other issues in the future. And so the conversation around geopolitics, I think, is one of the more important ones, just because of how interconnected the world is today. And I think you give a lot of really good insight, and your book is great, and people should buy the book. And I just appreciate you taking time to talk with me. So thanks so much.
My pleasure, Andy. I appreciate what you do. Thanks for having me on again.